Good morning, all of you. Uh, I was asked to talk about maybe the whole long-term decarbonization strategies for oil and gas sector. Now, for the whole sector, which is quite a different story than if you are saying only for the refining business, because there are usually considered three types or three scope for decarbonization. Scope one would be the firm by itself does not use any, doesn't emit any carbon, CO2. That will be, it would say I'm not using only renewable energy and so on. Scope two would be that the products that it uses as inputs in its processes, they do not emit any CO2. And the third one would be that the products that they make in their use, they do not produce any CO2. And that is where all the challenges comes for the oil and gas sector, that first stage, scope one, is somewhat easy. Scope 2 is a bit more difficult, and scope 3 is really tough for the energy, for the carbon sector. But in case the country wants to achieve its net zero target by 2070, this would require that we really, in fact, do something and very seriously take the scope 3 into account, because you can't use any product or anything in any way that produces carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So let me begin by saying that, you really look at the consumption of petroleum products in 23-24 in million tons, and certainly high-speed diesel is at the top of it. 90 million tons we are using of the total production of 233 million tons in the country. Total consumption in 23-24 was 233 million tons of petroleum products. 90 is high-speed diesel, motor spirit is 37, LPG is 30, naphtha is 14, and so on, and I have given the list here. And you can see that the emissions that take place is around 700 million tons of CO2 in the processes. This is a rough guess because it depends upon how the refineries' efficiencies are and so on. And I think if you say that if you want to have the refinery emissions around 50 million tons of CO2, that's what in its processes itself is using, largely using gas and maybe using gray hydrogen produced with the help of a gas. And these are somewhat relatively simple and easy to replace by green hydrogen and also electricity in many different ways. So the next thing is, what are the decarbonization options on scope 3 kind of thing? What would you do? How do we decarbonize HSD 90 million tons that we are using? And that is today, if you consider our projected growth, that will be much higher. So certainly electric vehicles would be, electric mobility, EV is the thing that we should do. And we are progressing in that direction. But EVs work for, I think, a short distance, low commercial vehicle, low load commercial vehicle. But it is not very convenient to think about it for heavy duty trucks which take long distance freight transport. So what can we do with the long distance freight transport? Well, we can think about moving a lot of the freight movement from road to rail, and that will be one way of doing it. And the railways, we know, is now going on a path to total electrification, so that it would be really a non-polluting way of moving things. However, people still, if you look at the last 15, 20 years, the share of railways in freight movement has been going down, and that of trucks has been increasing. And the reasons are many. I mean, we have better roads. Trucking is on assured door-to-door delivery and on time. And that railways, you don't really know how long will it take when your goods are sent from one place to the other. And so in 2005, when I was member of the Planning Commission, we had suggested that we start with a dedicated freight trade corridors so that you can move the traffic. Goods can go from a plate one to the other, and on a defined time level, they can compete with coal. Unfortunately, that first link of the dedicated freight trade corridor is not yet fully operational, but we hope sometimes within this or next year it will start working. The second issue would be motor spirit, and that is, I think, electric vehicles we all know is making significant progress, and particularly in the two-wheelers and three-wheeler section, it has made a lot of penetration. And it is easy because people can charge their scooters at home, at night, and so on, and that does not really require the whole charging infrastructure that four-wheelers would require. But I think we are on the way to having fully electrified motor transport movement. LPG, which is used largely currently for household consumption and heat purpose, that can easily be converted into electric. If you look at Western world, most of the cooking is done by electricity these days, and the introduction and the invention of induction cookers have made electric cooking even more attractive than it is. So whereas gas, whether it is CT, gas distribution-based pipe natural gas, or whether you have an LPG cylinders come delivered to your house, it would really very convenient to use them. But I think electric cooking would be equally convenient. And I'm sure that within 30, 40 years, we would see electric cooking really widely spread in the country. Now, the next thing is about hydrogen that we can use in a number of places in hard-to-abate sectors and so on, and maybe cellulosic ethanol, and various options are there. In some cases, we might have to resort to CCS or carbon capture and storage because we don't find very easy solutions for substitute for that. Yeah. Thank you. So I think lubricants is okay, but they're really not that much of carbon emitting in a sense. And there may be no choice excepting maybe vegetable oil or something like that. So I think let's look at the possible. Huh? No. Electric mobility, if you consider this, railways are almost fully electrified now. Dedicated freight train corridors will attract long-distance goods traffic, as we have suggested, and particularly when they introduce services like you carry the whole truck on the flatbed, and so the truck comes here, loads on the train goes from Bombay to Delhi, let's say, and then the train rolls off, the truck rolls off and delivers the goods. That certainly would provide service which is equivalent to time of trucking and might be equally or even cheaper than driving the truck all the way from one end to the other. Now, we have to think about not only passenger vehicles. We have a target for 30% of EV by 2030, and almost all vehicles sold would be electric vehicles. That's one of the goals of the government. And 100% would be by 2050. And if that happens, and goods, as I said, we want to ship to railways, short distance movement by light commercial vehicles, and then heavy commercial vehicles running on hydrogen. That's one possibility. Now, transport sector demand projection, if you look at it, that we have done at IRADE, that the passengers, you are looking at in billion passenger kilometers. In 2015, we have 11,700 billion passenger kilometers. This is an estimate. And that freight was about 700 billion ton kilometers. And that is expected to grow to something like 17,300 by 2050. And emissions would be nearly 5,000 billion. I mean, freight movement will be 5,000 billion ton kilometer. So emission from transport sector, if you look at it, is around 507 million tons of CO2 in 2021, and it can be almost 2,690 million tons of CO2 by 2070-71. But if you have 1% efficiency improvement in fuel consumption every year from 2015 to 30, let's say, then the emissions go down because then the fuel consumed is less, and total total emissions would come down from maybe 507 to 560 million. What am I saying? To 700 million tons in 2030 that we have projected to 560. Now, if 100% of EV can be have by 2050, which is the target of the government, then emissions can be reduced by 400 million tons in 2030-31 and can be zero by 2050-51. Now, these numbers do not really indicate how much effort and cost is involved in doing this, because there is a cost involved. Electric vehicles today are more expensive than this, largely because of the battery cost. And we are importing most of the batteries or the material for the batteries, lithium, etc., from countries like China. So in order to do this, we need to either develop our own lithium supply or do some innovative progress in battery technology so that we can make cheaper and lighter batteries than we currently are there. And I think the car itself, electric car, would be cheaper than the standard inter-combustion car, IC engine-based car. But the battery cost makes it much more expensive than this. Though the long-term, you could say, marginal cost or levelized cost is lower in electric vehicles today than in the IC vehicles. It requires upfront investment, and the question of what is the range is an anxiety about how much I can go, and that's the main thing in adoption of EV vehicles, and certainly for the four-wheelers, whereas the other thing is the charging and infrastructure is also another question. Now we can think about battery swapping, so it can be done in few minutes. Just as you take petrol, you just swap the batteries. But that has not yet been developed in an effective way as yet in the country. Now, if you go to the next thing, the National Green Hydrogen Mission is the one that we have also government has launched with a target of 5 million ton of 2030 and 30 to 40 million tons by 2050. Now, these are very ambitious targets in many ways. Currently, we are sort of using 5 million tons of hydrogen. Mainly, these are green hydrogen, not green hydrogen, this is gray hydrogen. This is made using natural gas. 3 million ton goes into the refinery sector and others in various other sources. So I think to replace that requires, you need to have renewable electricity, electrolyzer, and then convert it into hydrogen, which needs to be transported and so on. And we know all the difficulties of that. So, but in a hard-to-abate sectors, where electricity cannot easily substitute the processes, and then steel, cement, fertilizer, ceramics, high commercial vehicles, shipping, hydrogen would have a role to play. And that requires that we bring down the cost of hydrogen. It is currently around $4 a kilogram of hydrogen. And we need to bring it down to almost $1 a kilogram of hydrogen if you want to absorb in the economy 5 million tons of hydrogen, green hydrogen, and say 30, 40 million tons of green hydrogen by 2050. So I think what is really required is how much in resources and cost is involved in this green hydrogen is really the essential issue here. The electrolyzer today requires so much of electricity, the cost of electricity itself makes green hydrogen very expensive. But we can consider that for producing so much of green, what is the electrolyzer requirement? And this is again a study which we have done at IRADE. It says we need about 60 to 100 gigawatt of installed capacity of green electricity, solar, let's say, or wind. That is required. And then 460 to 600 gigawatt by 2050. So this is a large amount, you know. And then we have to consider what are the terawatt hours required? 257 or 1320 terawatt hours. And the investment requirement for electrolyzer and the rest of it would be almost 100 to 200 billion US dollars by 2030, and 400 to 600 billion dollars by 2050. So we can see that a very large amount of resources are needed. Unless we can make electrolyzer efficiency significantly higher, so that the cost of electricity and the cost of electrolyzer both can go down, and that the requirement would go down. But this is one way of one process, and that is really hydrogen would be required, but we need to worry about what's the cost of it to the economy and how do we bear that cost. One way would be that you say, okay, you are replacing so much of CO2. So what is the worth of 1 ton of CO2? And if you say 1 ton of CO2 is worth $70 or $100, then certainly hydrogen becomes competitive. If you put that much of tax on CO2 emissions on this hard-to-abate sector. But I think that is a far cry in my opinion. And lots of people in climate change talk about a carbon tax or and things. I think carbon tax would be a very effective and economically efficient instrument, provided you are given every country a quota, and they should know that they can emit only this much, and the remaining they have to buy from others who are emitting less. So unless that kind of an international carbon market is developed, I am not sure that carbon market and carbon pricing would be an efficient solution for us. Anyway, while hydrogen is certainly a technologically feasible option, its economic viability at this stage is somewhat difficult to assess, but one can say that, Reliance has a target of bringing down cost of hydrogen to less than $2 by 2030. Now, if that, and Reliance has in the past been quite successful in its various technology missions. So from that point of view, we can have some hope that yes, you will have lower cost hydrogen available in the country, and that technology improvement will take place. So with that, I think you recognize that stage one decarbonization for the refinery sector is relatively simple. You just replace gray hydrogen by green hydrogen, and gas and other fuel that we use can be easily replaced by electricity. That's not a big issue at all. Stage two would be somewhat difficult because you're bringing crude oil from international markets and so on. And so all this embedded CO2 in the refining operations inputs becomes really hard to accomplish. And stage three, which is what I really concentrated on today, or scope three, is really the toughest part of the business. But we have no choice if we are going to have net zero by 2070. And the world has no choice unless it gets net zero around that time, because we are seeing the significant impact of climate change or on what one might call extreme events, heat events, or droughts, or rains, and so on. And I think, so if you consider all the cost of that would really say that, yes, we need to do something. But unless US and China take lead in this, India cannot by itself do anything about it. And yet we need to go and take lead if the Prime Minister's aspiration to be Vishwa Guru or the teacher of the world is to be fulfilled. Thank you all.